not only do you have an increasing threat of nuclear war, and you have something that looks like a permanent war taking shape in this region, one that's spearheaded by NATO. It's dwindling weaponry, but nonetheless, its continued commitment to arm Ukraine. Not only do you have NATO expanding as we speak, Sweden, Finland, right, continued talks about Ukraine. Not only do you have that, but you also have a juncture where people are tired of this because working class people are getting hurt by this. Inflation is terrible in part. Inflation is so high in part because of this crisis, a major part of it. The energy crisis is absolutely decimating Europe, and it's going to decimate the United States if it already isn't already. It is already. So not only do you have those conditions, these unbearable economic conditions, the devastation on the battlefield, which is mainly being felt by Ukraine, but you also have a moment where Americans, according to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is funded by the Soros Open Society Foundation and a lot of different foundations. It has better politics than most of these foundations, but it is still a mainstream foundation, and it mainly focuses on what I would call like a bourgeois peace, like trying to figure out ways to keep the world order stable. And I think that's for business opportunities. So that's my hunch about the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. But they did a recent study that said that 60% of Americans would support the U.S. engaging in diplomatic efforts as soon as possible to end the war in Ukraine, even if that means Ukraine having to make concessions to Russia. The survey conducted for the Data for Progress on behalf of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft also found a plurality said Biden in Congress have not done enough diplomatically to help end the war. So you have people who are ready. You have people who want this, who want Ukraine to make concessions too. They don't care. So you have a majority of people who want that and they don't care. But yet Kyle Kalinske will say, well, only idiots think that Russia is not committing some kind of imperialist offensive invasion where Ukraine can't make any concessions, right? That's basically his position. That the only concession that can be talked about is possibly a reduction in weapons. But everything up until this point was okay. And, Russia's probably going to just mess everything up anyway, right? So none of this is helpful. None of that gets us closer to diplomacy or peace. I don't think any one of his viewers are going to be more energized to call for peace. So really, it shows just a level of whether we want to be nice about it and say confusion, or more forthright and firm and say that's just opportunism. Regardless of which one it is, the point is that the effect is the same, and the effect is that not helping, bro. We're just bored. We're just deeper than ever now because if tens of thousands of people watch that video, what are they going to be convinced of? Maybe they're not convinced because it's not a very good argument, but some of them will be convinced that yes, Russia's the enemy, Russia's imperialist, and that diplomacy is kind of just like a good thing that the U.S. should do because the U.S. can do good things. It's American exceptionalism, right? And it completely goes against the reality of the situation. And if anyone comes out of that believing the Iraq War and Ukraine are the same, the Ukraine conflict and the Iraq War are the same, then you've done a supreme disservice to the cause of peace, a supreme disservice. And you've spit on the graves of 1 million Iraqis. You've spit on the graves of millions more who have been devastated, displaced, of an entire region that's been destabilized by U.S. imperialism and real occupation, real neo-colonial occupation, like in Syria, the northern part of Syria. That's what that does. It completely trivializes something that's incredibly different. It trivializes it. So that's that story. And I spent a lot of time on this. So let's go on to the next story. The next story is going to be probably a shorter story, but it's all related. So, people like Kyle Kalinske, right? They believe that Russia's the enemy. And they probably believe that Russia has public opinion against it, right? And that's because there's a lot of navel gazing in the West, right? In the United States and the collective West, they like to think we get taught that we're the best, right? We're the best out here. Everything we do, no matter if we're pissing all over the planet, no matter if we're destroying it, no matter if the corporations that dictate our lives are absolutely polluting and waging war and increasing the level of extreme poverty and all poverty, no matter how much that's happening, right? Killing people in the streets, cops just killing people in the streets, incarcerating Black people more than maybe any other people in the rest of the world get incarcerated. No matter all of those contradictions and those issues, we're still the best, right? The American exceptionalist narrative, what is it? What one part of it is innocence, right? I talk about American exceptionalism, American innocence. That even if we concede, right, that the United States doesn't always do good, it's not always the quote unquote civilization, democracy we think it is, still better than over there, still better than Russia, we still got it good. And that helps wash away any kind of criminal identity. Now you're not so much a criminal, you're just making mistakes in a world that is full of bad apples, right? You're the best of the bad apples. And that's kind of how this takes shape, this American exceptionalist and Western exceptionalist mindset. That's how it is inculcated and ingrained in us. So people like Kyle Kalinske and others in the liberal class, they believe that Russia's the enemy and the United States was right to defend Ukraine. What does the world believe, though? Does the world believe this? What does the majority of the population in the world does not reside in the West, right? The majority of the population, more than 2/3 of it, resides in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, in countries you could call oppressed, neo-colonial, semi-independent, whatever you want to call countries that are still struggling with the contradictions of a long history of colonization and imperialist aggression, whatever you want to call them. They make up the most. They're the most populous part of the world, and so they stand with Russia and China. Many people don't consider that, but they do. Their governments, their countries stand with Russia and China, even through this Ukraine crisis. We've seen many examples of this. But I'm going to show you a new study by the University of Cambridge. And I'm just going to go over some of its executive summary. This new study that they've conducted, and the University of Cambridge is no friend of Russia and no friend of the impoverished majority. The University of Cambridge, their Center for the Future of Democracy, has produced a study called A World Divided, Russia, China in the West. So we're just going to go to the executive summary and the key findings. I'll just I'll read a little bit about their methodology, and then we'll get into the findings. Because this is definitive proof, right? Not even their survey tools will produce results that show that Russia and China are, you'll see how they twist it. There is a twist here. But nonetheless, the results are that Russia and China receive support from most of the world. And that's completely in contradiction to what the U.S. says. So in this report, it says the University of Cambridge, we examine how worldwide attitudes toward major international powers, China, Russia, and the U.S., are shifting in the wake of the Ukraine war, China's rising assertiveness, and recent challenges to American democracy. We do so by harmonizing emerging data from 30 global survey projects that collectively span 137 countries, representing 97% of the world population. This includes 75 countries surveyed since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, giving us updated insights into the current views of 83% of all people across the globe. As a result, our analysis covers not only high-income democracies, but also a comprehensive coverage of two emerging economies in the global south, revealing a marked divergence between the two. So on the one hand, Western democracies stand more firmly than ever behind the U.S. Not only that, but the war in Ukraine has galvanized so-called democratic societies worldwide as the peoples of upper income democracies in South America, the Asia Pacific, and Eastern Europe have also moved to a more pro-American stance. However, across a vast span of countries stretching the continental Eurasia to the north and west of Africa, we find the opposite: societies that have moved closer to China and Russia over the course of the last decade. As a result, China and Russia are now narrowly ahead of the US in their popularity among developing countries. While the war in Ukraine has accelerated this divide, it has been a decade in the making. As a result, the world is torn between two opposing clusters: a maritime alliance of so-called democracies. They use democracy. They're not democracies, they're oligarchies, but led by the US, and a Eurasian bloc of illiberal and autocratic. You see what they're doing here? Spreading that new Cold War propaganda, Russia and China. So I'll show you the key findings here, because no matter how much they spin it in terms of their language, in terms of their the way that they describe Russia and China, they can't ignore the results. So they said that the world is divided into liberal and illiberal spheres. So think of liberal as imperialist countries here. Imperialism, so liberal equals imperialism. Illiberal spheres means nations that are opposed to imperialism, nations that are independent of imperialism, socialist countries, and everything in between. That's how you should be looking at these words, okay? So it says among 1.2 billion people who inhabit the world's imperialist democracies, 3/4, 75%, now hold a negative view of China and 87% a negative view of Russia. However, for the 6.3 billion people who live, 6.3 billion, you hear that? Almost 6 times the size. For the 6.3 billion who live in the east, in the rest of the world, I almost said the east of the world, the rest of the world, the picture is reversed. In these societies, 70% feel positively towards China and 66% positively toward Russia. So there you go. There you have it. I'll read a little bit more, but the real important point here is that 6 billion people in the oppressed nations of the world, the poorer countries, the so-called developing countries, China and Russia, receive overwhelming support. While, of course, the imperialist countries that are mobilized against them, that are waging a new Cold War, are majority disfavorable, unfavorable of Russia and China. So yes, the world is divided, but who has more support, right? The only way you could consider the United States having more support than Russia and China is if you believe that the lives of people all in the African continent, South America, Caribbean, Asia, are not worth as much. And now that wouldn't be surprising from the University of Cambridge, and it certainly wouldn't be surprising from the United States. So here's how they try to twist it. They're not going to let you think that somehow China and Russia are popular. That couldn't be the case, right? Because there are shortcomings. Perceived democratic shortcomings are associated with greater public receptivity towards authoritarian powers. A majority of the public is dissatisfied with democratic performance. 7 out of 10, 69% of the countries favorable of Russia, and 73% of countries are dissatisfied with democracy in their countries who support China. So what they're trying to tell you is that they only support Russia and China because their countries are not as democratic as they would like them to be. That is what you call a spurious conclusion. That is how you tie in data points to serve a propaganda purpose, right? Because the definition of democracy is very, very narrow, I'm sure, in how they measure it. Because we know what they talk about democracy: voting, parliamentary elections, individual rights, all these things. So it's very narrow. But nonetheless, this is the agenda. The agenda is to tell people that Russia and China's popularity is probably because these countries are already authoritarian themselves. So authoritarian countries stick together, and they're just victims, right? It kind of feeds into this thought that, oh, maybe these people that live in these countries only think this way because they're scared, right? That's the narrative you hear about China and about most countries considered quote unquote authoritarian. Of course, they are favorable of their governments. Of course, they love other authoritarian countries. If they didn't, they would have a lot of trouble. It's jingoism, it's racism, it's imperialism, and that's what they're trying to promote to discredit the real key finding here, which is that 6.3 billion people, for the most part, 70%, 66 to 70% of them are supportive of Russia and China, even through this proxy war that NATO is leading. And so there's some more data points here that for the first time ever, more people in developing countries are favorable towards China than the United States. And this is especially so among 4.6 billion people living in countries supported by the Belt and Road Initiative, among whom two-thirds of people hold a positive view of China compared to just a quarter, 27% in non-participating countries. So there you have it. When people are exposed to China's development model and the cooperation in it, people tend to like it. All right. So we don't have to go into the rest of this because it's all more of the same, kind of going back and forth, showing that Russia and China's popularity is not so robust. You know, it's trying to say that popularity in the global south comes at a cost, dramatic collapse in developed countries, right? So-called imperialist countries, the real imperialist countries, the favorability has gone way down. So, and the same has gone for Russia. So Russia and China have lost popularity. That's what they're saying in Western countries, Western imperialist countries, and their junior partners, but have gained a lot of support in the global south. So this is the global trend. So University of Cambridge, the Center for Future Democracy, this obvious think tank coming out of this major corporate-funded institution, they're revealing what people think. So Russia and China are not alone. They're not isolated. The people of the world's majority stand with them. And these are the emerging economies. These are the most resource-rich countries. And these are the countries rich in history of resistance to imperialism as well. Can't forget that, because University of Cambridge would have us forget that. But that's part of the identification, right? That's why you had in Baghdad signs supportive of Putin and Russia during the special military operation. That's why you have China and Vietnam. We're going to get to this story next. China and Vietnam meeting, right? Meeting and talking about real cooperation, Belt and Road Initiative, right? You have this happening because there is a new alignment afoot. Multipolarity is not just about having different systems coexisting with each other, cooperating with each other in a way that eschews unipolar hegemony, that gets rid of this idea that one country should rule all. It's not just about that. It's about oppressed nations, socialist countries, underdeveloped countries, countries with histories of colonialism, imperialism coming together and forging a new path forward economically, politically, militarily, right? Charting a path forward that adheres to the United Nations Charter, to international law, and puts these countries in the vanguard of that, rather than the United States and its junior partners and its imperialist partners saying that, no, we run the world and that the UN is only useful when we can run the world through it. This is the opposite of that. And this is why public opinion toward Russia and China is raising, because Russia and China offer alternatives. China especially offers a new economic alternative, a political alternative, one of stability, of peace, of development. That is without question. China's income has risen. Extreme poverty has been eradicated, right? Per capita income in China has risen monumentally in the last several decades alone. China was able to avoid the economic crisis of 2007, 2008 in large part. And in large part, China saved it. China saved the economic system, the world economic system, through what it was able to do monetarily with foreign exchange reserves. So when we're talking about things like de-dollarization and multipolarity, Russia and China are at the forefront. We're talking about real independence, a real sense of nationalism with the characteristics of internationalism, binding the two together. It's possible. And these countries are showing that it's possible to both defend sovereignty and the interests of the entire country, right? The interests of the vast majority, as well as forging a path forward that is in solidarity with the people of the world, and that shows compassion and generosity and mutual cooperation and the ability to merge interests together. That is entirely possible. That is what this study shows, that people around the world are waking up to that. They are waking up. China is only becoming more formidable globally in terms of its ability to uh, forge close relationships with all countries, all global South countries, right? Now that Lula is president of Brazil, expect that relationship to strengthen. Russia's doing the same thing. Look at what happened on the African continent. No one wanted to show up to Zelensky's meeting, right? I think he had 4 leaders of more than 54 African countries show up to a Zoom call. African leaders don't want to be associated with Zelensky. Zelensky is stumping for the colonialists, for the imperialists. That's who he's stumping for. He's a puppet of them. African countries want sovereignty. Even the most U.S. Western aligned African government wants more sovereignty because honestly, their existence depends on it. Their existence depends on it. It depends on better relationships. It depends on better economic opportunities, more economic growth. Are they going to get that from the US and from the West? No. Because what do they offer? Loans and guns. Guns and loans, right? That's what they offer. What does China and Russia offer? Infrastructure, resources, key energy resources like Russia does, grain, Russia, China, all kinds of goodies, manufacturing goodies, and then high value added goods like 5G technology, rail technology, the best of the best in this area. Green technology in order to preserve the environment and to better help fight climate change on the African continent, something that's incredibly huge for Africa because of its climate and because of the vast resources that many of which have yet to be developed in a sovereign way, right? So this is the move for the world. The world is moving toward Russia and China, their leadership, and it is moving away from the United States and the West. So the US and the West will come together as much as they can, try to huddle underneath their blankets because it's about to get real cold this winter for them because of the energy crisis. So they're all going to have to huddle under a blanket together and start preparing for nuclear war, right? That's what they're doing. They're huddling together. They're hoping that they don't have to go into nuclear war because it'll destroy the system. But there's a lot of forces within their imperialist apparatus that are saying this is probably the only option. So let's keep moving in that direction. So they're going to huddle under their blanket and do that, and they'll alienate the rest of the world. And the rest of the world will say China and Russia are much better friends, much better partners, and there are much more opportunities to be had from cooperation with them. And so that's what they're going to do. Can you blame? Can you blame them? No, you can't. And not only can you not blame them, but that's more favorable. I support it 100%. This is not just what I would want to happen. This is the only thing that can happen outside of being completely strangled economically, politically, and militarily by imperialism.